let's just say one of the students in the high school tests positive, develops symptoms, goes to get a test, tests positive. What's going to happen with the follow-up from that? Who does the contact tracing? It would be probably short-sighted to think that, let's say that student is a resident of Wenham, that Maribeth alone can deal with all of that without coordinating with Leah or the nurse in the school that student's attending. I just think it makes sense to try to have an open line of communication amongst all of the nurses who are involved in the whole business of contact tracing, the initial call, et cetera. And in particular, let's say it's a young student, and you almost have to get the parents involved. I think you can't just ignore the school. You have to get them involved. So it's a complicated communication process. So I think that's why we've got to have all of them on the same page. So that's one of the three action items is to, and Chris Lee agreed to lead that, to have at least Christine and Mary Beth and Leah communicate regularly on how they're going to deal with just that issue, for example. The second had to do with Mary Beth Barrios's. I got to be careful with my Mary Beths. There's about 3 or 4 in my various activities here. So Mary Beth Barrios asked about what would happen what would be the triggers for action by either of the local boards to, for example, decide it's time to close a school, close the whole school district. Remember, we did that back in March, kind of ahead of the game. So I'm going to take the lead in trying to develop a blueprint for how we're going to respond to reports of positive cases in either town, with respect to how many within a certain number of days, how many within a certain geographical area, how many within a school, so on, would be a trigger for actions by the one or both boards to attempt to control the situation. That's the second area. And then the third, Mary Beth, tell me if my memory serves me. I'm probably a little off base on what I suggested in the email to you, but what's your recollection on that third item?
You have overstated the powers of my recollection. But when you sent the email and said that it was about coordinating sort of safety protocols, taking a look at what was coming from DESE, because there was the large document that was released, I think it was the 17th that was released, about facilities and
yes, and Tom Geary.
Yes.
How to keep the schools safe.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's yet a third area, and that's a huge. The three together represent a huge scope of work of effort for our two boards. But those were the action items that we agreed. So that's a kind of a summary of the 1 hour meeting we had with Mary Beth. I participated in the Board of Selectmen, the Hamilton Board of Selectmen meeting on this past Monday night, when the board asked Mary Beth to join that meeting and introduce herself. And I briefed the board on what I thought was a terrific first meeting of the two boards of health and Mary Beth Barrios, the new superintendent. So I think we're off to a good start.
I had a question in terms of what's being taken or how protocols are being developed and what's being discussed, but is one aspect of it what protocol will be followed if students present with cold-like symptoms, especially the younger ones? And that's typically, I think we've discussed how COVID-19 presents in children. And again, we don't know really what the impact would have, but I'm thinking, you know, with teachers especially. So what would be the protocol if a student presents with symptoms that are cold-like?
That's exactly, Dr. Perez, that's exactly the question that I think Chris Lee and her working group are going to be confronting and trying to figure out what's the answer to that question. Christine, do you have any preliminary thoughts on that?
Part of the issue is the isolation, that you would then attempt to isolate the child for the time being in the health office, or potentially another space that isn't in the health office, where the child would be potentially contaminating the rest of the students that need to come in. But then you also need someone visualizing that child. So potentially they are masked and put in the middle school. There's a side room, but you could leave the door open. They would remain 6 feet. It brings up many issues, because the children that utilize the health office tend to be children with diabetes, different issues of this nature. Also, another piece that I wanted to discuss with the group on our first meeting is when we will let people know that their child is in fact a contact of a positive, that the ideal time to get the true picture of your health is 4 to 5 days. In all likelihood, people will want to immediately go test their child within 24, if not 12 hours, and turn them right back around and send them to school. So there will have to be some sort of regulation or protocol that we follow, that they're not immediately allowed back to school. There's a lot to be worked out.
Yeah, because I think especially colds are inevitable.
Right.
They're going to happen, and I'm thinking, you know, especially like if even that issue of isolation, it raises the risk for those who have, you know, who are higher risk, right? If they have diabetes and they're going to the nurse. But then when do they come back? Because if it's a cold, how do you wait till you get tested? I think all those pieces are the things that I'm wondering about. And I feel like it would be much more comforting to know that there is a protocol in place to address the inevitable.
Right.
So if I could speak to that briefly, I would
That would
say
be
that
great.
not only is, and this is wearing both my school nurse hat as well as my public health nurse hat, and I would say that for one thing, you know, DESE is working on guidelines, and we at the local Board of Health calls with DPH have raised the concern that DESE set up a guidance that is quite different from what we've been getting from DPH for the past many months. And what I mean by that is the current DESE guidance is if a student is identified as a close contact and they test negative, they are then allowed to return to school. That's true of students as well as faculty and staff, which goes against the 14-day quarantine that we've been using ever since late February, March. So that's concerning, and that's been raised with the state, and we're asking the state to kind of jive with the DESE. I would say candidly, we haven't got a satisfactory response just yet. We've just been told that the medical advisors to DESE have said that this is the way we should go. I'm hoping that we might see something that's a little bit more explicatory, as in we're finding that with younger children that the transmission is less, and so the duration of quarantine doesn't need to be as long. Personally, it doesn't make sense to me that that guidance would go for adults. I just, you know, unless we have some science to go by, I don't see why we would be shifting that guidance. So that's one thing. I would also say that both state and national school nurses and the national organization are working very hard, as is the Mass Teachers Association, in looking at safe guidance for return to school and what these protocols are going to look like. So as Chris said, the DESE guidance is requiring that we have an isolation room in all of our schools for students requiring isolation. And so all of our school administrators are working with our school nurses to identify where that place will be and what's the proximity to the school nurse office, so that ideally students needing isolation, but we'll have to be working with teachers to identify, okay, student is coming, so instead of coming to the health office, they should be rerouted to the isolation room. So I wish I could say that we were, in the A to Z, more like X, but I don't think we're that far along yet. So we're still working on how that will go. And that's why it's very helpful that DESE has allowed for the shorter school year and the later start to the school year, so that there can be the preparation days for faculty and staff, which will include the school health office staffs.
I think there was a question about whether the boards of health provide guidance to the school committee to make policy, or the boards of health will make their policy in which the school committee would have to follow. And I think it's not, I think we're going to find over the next couple of weeks with you guys, when they're working with the schools, that they should be jiving together. I mean, DESE, a lot of what that comes out of DESE is the same thing that we have already with local boards of health. But like Maribeth mentioned, some of it is a little off from what we have guidance for. So I think hopefully DESE will get more clarification, as well as the local boards of health will be asking DESE for clarification, as well as alignment with current policies. So where we end up, it's too early to know. But I think, again, definitely the boards of health make policies for the citizens of Wenham. And if that also includes students and faculty at the school, to some extent, yes, that would apply. But then there are other ways that the schools, I assume, are going to make some protocols and procedures that would entail those kinds of policies. Does that sound right, David?
Yeah, Andrew, I'm looking at the questions that Michelle Bailey in particular has posed some good ones here. You've addressed the third of the three she's posed. Yeah. And I think the understanding that we had with Superintendent Barrios last week was that neither of us, none of the parties here is probably going to have all of the answers and be able to dictate something. We agreed to work cooperatively together to try to reach mutual agreement on answers to questions, solutions to problems. So it's probably premature, Michelle, for us to say which it is that it's going to be. We don't know yet. It's just too soon. But you've posed a couple of other points here that I think are worth mentioning, and that is you point out that about 100 choice students come to the school district from outside of Hamilton Wenham. They presumably are going to be residents from some other community. And let's just say if one of those children tests positive, neither Christine nor Maribeth would know that. And I think that begins to that's one of these kinds of complications we're going to have to deal with. I don't know how that information is going to be taken into account in the school district.
David, if I may, in our case identification and contact tracing currently, there are times that we will receive a contact from another municipality. Mm-hmm. So, the case may live in Swansea, and they identify that they, were visiting their aunt in Wenham and had close personal contact. So the Swansea nurse will notify the Wenham nurse, so the Wenham nurse can be following up. And so I would imagine it's going to be the same way. I think one of the things that we as public health nurses will have to be wise and doing more often is to ask where the child attends school. So that, if it's a minor attending school, we could just check in and say, where do you attend school? And if it's outside of the home school district, then, there are mechanisms by which we can communicate with other districts.
Okay, good. That's good to know. Another question Michelle posed was having to do with the staff comes from a pretty wide geographical area, that's for sure.
And David, the answer to that is very similar to the one that I just gave you. When we do the case investigation, we do ask where people work and what kind of work they do. And so we, as you know, sort of a courtesy, we would let the other municipality know. Particularly if it's going to be a school-related contact, we would be communicating with the other community to give them a heads up so that they can have their antenna up for any possibility of a cluster.
Okay. So those are good questions Michelle posed, and we appreciate them.
Chris, you had your hand up?
Yes, that's why the importance of answering our call and the immediacy of the work. We are receive a positive, and then we immediately call out. If we don't take the case in time, the CTC will take it, and the call is made. You're looking to contact a person within 72 hours, and I don't know for Maribeth, but for myself, that's even too long of a time frame. I get notification and I am in touch with someone within 8 to 10 hours. The part that makes it most important is that the person we're speaking with is quite transparent, and it's a 48-hour recall. Where do you go? Right down to, did you have breakfast at a local restaurant that you frequent? And we make a point to call every single place where you have been, particularly places that you frequent. In the past, it would have been a gym or something along these lines. So 2 points that I make, it's really an intense scan of your past 48 hours. And that's what takes so much effort in all of these cases. That's why we beg and plead, keep your mask on and you're 6 feet. Because you then can do hours of one of the cases that one of the nurses tracing with me, she called Utah, she called Andover, Malden, there was someone that Alaska. We were literally making these calls. That's part of the tracing effort. So it doesn't matter what town you're in or what state for that matter, but we just, the 48 hours of where you have been and what you have done is what we try to track immediately when we get the case. So we'll get you no matter where you are. We'll find you. Thank you.
Great.
Chris,
Thank you.
Chris and Maribeth, I have to say you guys are amazing. I can't even imagine all the work that you guys are putting into this. So thank you. Thank you for that. I have one final question, and I think especially when the board meets with the superintendent, but is there a psychologist on board or an adjustment counselor that's also working with the committee to just kind of address the opening? I think kids are doing well, but there are changes, obviously, that they're experiencing, especially with the new school year. So to what extent is there a sort of provider on board consulting?
Giselle, that's a really great question. And we do have a district-wide, I can't remember Dr. Kristen Lazaro's title at the moment, but I believe she's K through 12, and we do have psychologists on board. So that's a really good thing for the next time we speak to our superintendent to mention. She may have already tapped that, and I'm just unaware at this point in time, but I'm very pleased that you brought that up. That's something good to remember. And just a final comment about Michelle's question about policy. One final way that the school nurses are working, we do have a school physician, Dr. Hugh Taylor in Hamilton, and we do consult with him around procedural issues. So Michelle, we will be working with him about some, day-to-day procedural from the health office decision-making.
All right. I don't want to cut off anyone, but the Wenham folk, we have our meeting right after this at 3 o'clock, and we have a full agenda, so I don't want to go overboard. So I'll just give it in terms of update and Wenham. We have a couple agenda items which are happy for Hamilton folk if you want to listen to that. We've been working actually with Gordon College as they start to return. They have a on-campus / hybrid kind of model, and so We're going to talk about a bit about their protocol, which is pretty intense, but now adjusted because of the governor's new travel advisory. So we'll be talking about that, as well as we've had we're having a discussion about Pleasant Pond, which is one of the areas that we had closed and remain closed, and that will be a discussion there. So happy to have anyone wants to be on that Zoom, which is a different link than the Zoom you're on now. So just to make sure, you have to go to the Wenham webpage and find the separate Zoom link on that agenda if you want to join that one.
Andrew,
But otherwise, yep.
Andrew, much like you, we have been having a continuing dialogue with the folks over at the Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary on their student body and plans for the fall. So it's, I think, so far so good, but we have a really good open dialogue with them. Another is Pingree School. I've been in regular contact with Pingree School about their plans for reopening in the fall. And in fact, Christine Lee suggested that we incorporate into the working group of the public health nurses and school nurses, the Pingree School the Pingree School nurse, Allison Watson, I think is their last name, Walker. So these are all good things that are going on, and it's just hard to keep up with everything.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, I agree with you. And you've got a full meeting obviously ahead of you, a full agenda. And we're nearly out of our time, so I'm satisfied.
All right. Did we have any suggestion of when we as a joint board wanted to meet again? I know that, so Maribeth and Chris, you guys are meeting with the superintendent Friday, and I'm sure there'll be some more working groups between then. David, when do you think we should meet again?
I'm thinking it certainly, it ought to be a couple of weeks before whatever is the scheduled start of the school year. I'm guessing that's going to be perhaps the last week of August, if not sooner. Dr. Perez, what do you think? When are you expecting your kids to go back to school? Do you know?
Right now, they've, I think the most recent news we received a couple of weeks ago was after Labor Day, but I think that may be pushed given the new news that has been received. I think it's September 14th for the state.
Okay.
Is it September 14th for those who remember, maybe more clear? Oh, Michelle actually would know best. Has that been decided? Okay, so it's still after Labor Day. Okay, so as of now, still after Labor Day,
Well,
based on Michelle's news.
it certainly ought to be no later than the last week of August, possibly sooner, but I think in our continuing dialogue with Superintendent Barrios, we'll have a better sense of when when our two boards ought to get together again with, I think, a particular subject matter being the school district.
Yeah, so probably then maybe mid-August for us. That would give us another time to have another meeting, either early September or
Okay.
such.
That
Okay.
sounds good, Andrew. Yep.
All right, so we'll work on a date and a time if this one works. Some people had a question because it's sort of during the workday, whether or not there was other times available. So maybe we'll do a little survey to see what would work in 2 weeks.
Okay.
All right.
Dr. Ting, can I just clarify for the recording secretary? Catherine, Dr. Ting mentioned that Christine Lee and I will be meeting with the superintendent this Friday. I just wanted to clarify that will be with Leah Tabankin, the district nurse leader, and not the superintendent, just for the minutes.
Thank you for that clarification.
You're welcome.
All right.
Okay, if no further business, I'm going to make a motion that the Hamilton Board of Health adjourn. Is there a second?
I second that motion.
All in favor, say aye. David Smith, aye.
I, Giselle Perez.
Aye, Christopher Small.
Okay, our meeting adjourned.
So I'm Andrew Ting. I'm going to put a motion to adjourn the Wenham Board of Health component of this joint meeting. Do I have a second? Oh, you're muted, Regina.
I second, sorry.
All right. All in favor of adjourning, say aye.
Aye.
Aye, Regina Baker. I think Jerry was on here.
Jerry is muted. He just needs to unmute.
Jerry, you want
I'm having trouble. I can't unmute Jerry. He's gonna have to.
All right. So give me a thumbs up if you want to adjourn. All right. Jerry says aye, and then I'm Andrew Ting. I say aye. So this adjourns the Wenham board portion.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
guys. All right. So
Anyone that wants to continue on,
Thank
the
you. Bye-bye.
link on the agenda is live for the 3 o'clock meeting. If you just click that, it'll open it for you.
All right. Thank you.